I'm a waitress. The billionaire CEO froze when I said, "That's my dad's signature." The smallest things are often the ones nobody is supposed to notice. Madison Harper had spent 3 years serving coffee inside Reed Global headquarters, and during those 3 years she learned something important. Powerful people rarely looked at the waitress carrying the tray. They looked through her. That was why nobody noticed when she stepped quietly into the executive boardroom that Thursday morning. The room itself looked like something from a business magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan. Sunlight reflected across polished glass and steel. Attorneys sat beside executives. Financial advisors reviewed final documents. Everyone seemed focused on one thing: Jonathan Reed. At 43, he was one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in the country. Newspapers followed his decisions. Investors trusted his judgment. Competitors feared his success. This morning, he was preparing to sign the largest acquisition agreement in company history. Madison moved carefully between the chairs carrying a silver coffee service. The atmosphere felt tense but controlled. Millions of dollars had already been discussed. Millions more were waiting on the signature. Jonathan flipped through the final pages while attorneys nodded their approval. Cameras stood ready to record the historic moment. Someone joked nervously about celebrating afterward. A few executives laughed. Then the room grew quiet. Jonathan picked up a fountain pen. Madison stepped closer to refill a coffee cup near the end of the table. She barely glanced at the documents. First. Then her eyes landed on the signature page beneath Jonathan's hand. The spoon resting against her tray slipped and struck a coffee cup with a sharp metallic sound. Nobody paid attention. Nobody except Madison. Her heart stopped. For one impossible second, she forgot where she was. She forgot the executives. She forgot the cameras. She forgot the city outside the windows. All she could see was a name written across the paper. A familiar name. A familiar signature. Every curve of the letters felt burned into her memory. She had seen it on birthday cards. She had seen it on Christmas notes. She had seen it at the bottom of letters her mother still kept in a box at home. David Harper. Her father. The father who disappeared 22 years ago. Madison stared at the page. Her fingers tightened around the tray. Jonathan continued reading, unaware that a waitress standing 10 feet away looked as though she had seen a ghost. The signature could not be there. It made no sense. Her father had vanished when she was 7 years old. No explanation. No goodbye. No answers. Yet somehow his handwriting sat on a legal document inside the headquarters of one of the largest corporations in America. Jonathan lowered the pen and signed the final page. Applause filled the room. Executives smiled. Cameras flashed. The deal was complete, but Madison barely heard any of it. Her eyes remained fixed on the document. Then something happened she would never forget. Jonathan turned the page and briefly exposed the signature again. Close enough. Clear enough. There could be no mistake. Before fear could stop her, before common sense could intervene, Madison heard her own voice break the silence. "That is my dad's signature." The applause stopped. Jonathan Reed froze. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The boardroom remained frozen beneath the afternoon sunlight. The executives looked from Madison to Jonathan. The attorneys stared at each other. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Jonathan Reed's hand remained resting on the document he had just signed. His expression had changed completely. It was subtle. Most people in the room probably would not have noticed it. Madison did. The confidence that normally surrounded him had vanished for a moment, replaced by something else. Recognition. Jonathan slowly looked down at the signature, then back at Madison. "What did you just say?" His voice was calm, but quieter than before. Madison swallowed. Every instinct told her she should leave the room. She was a waitress standing inside a meeting meant for billion-dollar decisions. Yet something stronger pushed her forward. 22 years of unanswered questions refused to stay silent. "I said that is my dad's signature." The room seemed to shrink around her. Jonathan looked at the page again. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. Another executive shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Madison could feel dozens of eyes watching her, but she did not look away. She knew what she had seen. Jonathan finally closed the document and stood. "Everyone, give us a few minutes." The request was polite. The response was immediate. Within moments, the room emptied. Doors closed. Footsteps faded into the hallway. Only Jonathan and Madison remained. The silence felt enormous. Jonathan walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. For several seconds, he stared at the city below. Then he turned back toward her. "Your father's name is David Harper?" Madison nodded. "Yes." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "How old are you?" The question caught her off guard. 29. Jonathan remained silent again. Madison could almost see him sorting through memories. Names, dates, fragments of information buried somewhere deep in the past. Finally he spoke. "I have heard that name before." Madison's heart immediately began racing. "Where?" Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I do not know yet." His answer sounded honest. That made it even more unsettling. Madison looked toward the document still resting on the table. "Who signed that file?" Jonathan walked back and opened the folder. He examined the final page carefully. The signature is part of an archived authorization attached to the acquisition records. Madison stepped closer. "How old is it?" Jonathan checked the reference number printed near the bottom. His expression darkened. 22 years. Madison felt the air leave her lungs. 22 years. The exact amount of time since her father disappeared. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. The coincidence was too precise. Too impossible. Images began flashing through Madison's mind. A small train station. Her father's smile. The promise he made before leaving on what was supposed to be a short business trip. The way he hugged her and promised he would be home soon. The way she waited by the window afterward. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Then years. Yet she never forgot his handwriting. Jonathan noticed the emotion crossing her face. "You really believe this belongs to him?" Madison looked directly at him. "I know it does." Jonathan stared at the signature one more time. Then he closed the folder carefully. What happened next surprised both of them. "Come with me," he said. "If that signature belongs to your father, then there is something inside this company that neither of us understands yet." Jonathan led Madison through a quiet executive hallway few employees ever entered. The celebration surrounding the acquisition continued somewhere behind them, but its energy felt distant now. Neither spoke. The only sound came from their footsteps moving across polished marble floors. A few minutes later, Jonathan opened the door to a private conference room connected directly to his office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The afternoon sun reflected across the glass skyline. Madison stood near the door, still holding the empty coffee tray. Everything about the situation felt unreal. 20 minutes earlier she had been serving coffee. Now she was standing alone with one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. Jonathan placed the acquisition file on the table and opened it again. His eyes settled on the signature page. David Harper. The name seemed to carry its own weight. Madison noticed something unusual. Jonathan was not studying the signature anymore. He was staring at the name itself. "You recognize him?" she said quietly. Jonathan looked up immediately. For a moment neither moved. Then he exhaled slowly. "I recognize the name." Madison felt her pulse quicken. "From where?" Jonathan walked toward a bookshelf near the wall. Several framed photographs sat among awards and company histories. He picked up one of the frames and stared at it. "When I was a kid, my father used to mention someone named David Harper." Madison stepped closer. Jonathan continued. "I was young, maybe 10 or 11. I never paid much attention. It sounded like business." He paused. "But I remember the name because it came up more than once." Madison's heart pounded. For 22 years she had lived with nothing but questions. Now a stranger seemed to be holding the first real piece of an answer. Jonathan set the photograph back down. "My father respected very few people. David Harper was one of them. Silence filled the room. Madison stared at the signature again. The familiar handwriting pulled her backward through time. Suddenly she was 7 years old again. Standing beside a train platform on a cool autumn morning. Her father kneeling in front of her. Smiling. Promising he would be back soon. She remembered the smell of coffee from the station cafe. The gray coat he always wore. The way he squeezed her shoulder before boarding the train. Most of all, she remembered his final words. "Be brave, Maddie. I will be home before you know it." The memory faded. The years that followed had been filled with waiting. Waiting for phone calls that never came. Waiting for letters that never arrived. Waiting for answers nobody could provide. Jonathan interrupted her thoughts. "There is something else." Madison looked up. His expression had become more serious. "The date on this authorization record is almost exactly 22 years old." Madison swallowed hard. The same year her father disappeared. Jonathan slowly closed the folder. "That is too much of a coincidence for me." He moved toward his computer and opened an internal company database. Thousands of archived records filled the screen. Most had not been viewed in years. Jonathan entered a single search term. David Harper. The system processed the request. Then several results appeared. Madison stepped closer. Jonathan stared at the screen. His expression changed again. This time it was not surprise. It was concern. Because according to the company's own records, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase David Harper from its history. Madison stared at the screen without blinking. The search results were real, yet they made no sense. Her father's name appeared dozens of times throughout the company's oldest records, but every entry looked incomplete. Entire sections had been removed. Attached files were missing. Meeting notes ended abruptly. Dates existed without explanations. It felt less like a corporate archive and more like a puzzle with half the pieces deliberately taken away. Jonathan sat down in front of the computer and opened the first record. David Harper. External legal consultant. Trusted advisor. The entry ended there. No biography. No employment history. No departure record. Nothing. Jonathan frowned. "This is not normal." Madison stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Jonathan pointed at the screen. "People do not simply disappear from corporate records, especially someone involved at this level." He opened another file. Then another. The pattern remained the same. References existed everywhere. Details existed nowhere. It looked as though someone had gone through the archives and carefully removed every explanation while leaving just enough behind to prove David Harper once existed. Madison felt a chill run through her. For years she had believed her father disappeared from her life. Now she was beginning to realize he had disappeared from history as well. Jonathan continued searching. Finally, one result opened successfully. A meeting log dated 22 years earlier. The file listed several participants. Senior executives, legal advisors, board representatives, and David Harper. Madison leaned forward. "Open it." Jonathan clicked the document. Most of the text had been deleted. Only fragments remained. Yet one sentence survived. Recommendation approved by David Harper and Charles Reed. Madison looked at Jonathan. "Charles Reed." Jonathan nodded slowly. "My father." The room fell silent. This was the first direct connection they had found. Not a rumor. Not a memory. A documented record. Their fathers had worked together. Closely enough to approve major decisions. Jonathan opened another surviving attachment. This one contained a scanned photograph reference. The image itself was missing, but the caption remained. Strategic Review Committee. Annual Leadership Retreat. Madison felt her pulse quicken. Her father had not been a minor consultant. He had been deeply involved with the company. Far more than her family ever knew. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "There is something else bothering me." Madison looked at him. "What?" He hesitated before answering. "Every deleted file seems connected to the same period." He pointed at the dates. "The months right before your father disappeared." Madison stared at the screen. The realization settled heavily between them. Whatever happened 22 years ago was not random. It was connected. The missing records, the missing explanations, the missing man. Jonathan opened one final search result hidden deep inside an archived legal directory. The file contained only a storage reference. No description, no summary, just a location code and a handwritten notation scanned into the system years earlier. Jonathan enlarged the image. Madison's breath caught instantly. The handwriting belonged to her father. She recognized it immediately. Beneath the location code, David Harper had written 7 simple words. If necessary, look inside the archive. Jonathan looked at Madison. Madison looked back at him. Somewhere inside Reed Global, her father had hidden something. And for 22 years, nobody had found it. Jonathan did not waste any time. Within 30 minutes, he and Madison were standing inside a restricted section of the company's oldest archive facility. The storage area sat 3 levels below the original headquarters building, hidden behind secured doors few employees even knew existed. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the distance beneath dim overhead lights. Dust floated through the air. Time itself seemed preserved inside the room. Madison looked around slowly. Every box, every folder, every cabinet represented a piece of forgotten history. Somewhere among them, her father had hidden something important enough to leave behind a message 22 years earlier. Jonathan carried a printed copy of the storage reference they found in the database. The location code pointed toward the far end of the archive. Neither spoke much as they walked. The silence felt appropriate. The deeper they moved into the archive, the more it felt like they were walking backward through time. Finally, they reached a narrow aisle lined with records from more than 2 decades earlier. Jonathan examined the shelf numbers. Madison followed the sequence until her eyes landed on a faded label. The code matched exactly. Her pulse immediately quickened. On the shelf sat a small gray storage box. Unlike the surrounding containers, it carried no department name and no official archive markings. Only a handwritten number. Jonathan carefully lifted it onto a nearby table. For several seconds, neither moved. The box looked ordinary. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything Madison had ever seen. Jonathan opened the lid. Inside were several folders tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them rested a brass key sealed inside a small envelope. Madison carefully picked up the envelope. Across the front were 2 handwritten words. For Madison. Her breath caught instantly. The handwriting belonged to her father. There was no doubt. Jonathan quietly stepped back as she opened it. Inside was the key and a short note. If you are reading this, then you found the right place. Keep looking. The truth is hidden deeper than records. Madison read the note twice, then a third time. The message answered nothing. Yet somehow it made everything more real. Her father had expected someone to find this. Perhaps he had hoped she would. Jonathan began examining the folders. Most contained meeting schedules, legal reviews, and correspondence from years before Madison was born. Then he stopped. Look at this. Madison moved closer. Jonathan handed her an old photograph. The image showed a group of executives standing outside a corporate retreat center. Near the center stood a younger version of Jonathan's father. Beside him stood David Harper. Both men were smiling. Both looked completely at ease. They were not distant business associates. They looked like trusted partners, friends. Madison stared at the photograph. For years she had imagined her father disappearing into darkness. Yet here he stood in plain sight, connected directly to the people who built Reed Global. She turned the photograph over. A handwritten caption appeared on the back. Strategic Leadership Committee. Summer Summit. 22 years ago. Below the caption were several signatures. One belonged to Charles Reed. Another belonged to David Harper. Madison traced her finger across the familiar handwriting. Then she noticed something else. Beneath the signatures, almost hidden near the corner of the photograph, someone had written a single word. Basement. Jonathan looked at her. Madison looked back at him. Whatever her father wanted them to find, the archive was only the beginning. The word written on the back of the photograph followed Madison and Jonathan for the rest of the afternoon. Basement. It was too deliberate to ignore. David Harper had left clues with purpose. Every message seemed designed to lead someone step by step toward a hidden truth. Jonathan studied the old building schematics stored in the archive while Madison reviewed the contents of the gray storage box again. Most of the documents appeared ordinary. Meeting schedules, legal correspondence, travel records. Yet the deeper they looked, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. David Harper had been preparing for something. He had organized records carefully. He had left instructions. He had hidden evidence. And somehow he had known that one day someone would come searching. Finally, Jonathan found something. The original headquarters building contained a lower storage level that no longer appeared on current maps. The space had been sealed during renovations nearly 20 years earlier. Most employees did not know it existed. Madison immediately sat forward. "Can we access it?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "If the original access route still exists." An hour later, they stood in a service corridor deep beneath the oldest section of the company. The area looked untouched by time. Exposed pipes lined the ceiling. Concrete walls stretched into the distance. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. Madison held the brass key her father had left behind. Felt heavier now. More important. At the end of the corridor, they discovered a metal door partially hidden behind old maintenance equipment. No sign marked its purpose. No records mentioned it. Yet mounted beside the handle sat an old lock. Madison looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked at the key. Neither spoke. Madison slowly inserted the key into the lock. Turned smoothly. The door opened. A cool draft moved through the darkness beyond. Jonathan switched on a flashlight. Inside was a small storage room. Dust covered every surface. Shelves lined the walls. At first glance, the room appeared abandoned. Then Madison noticed a single wooden box sitting alone on a table near the center. Unlike everything else, it looked intentionally placed. Waiting. Her heart pounded as she approached. On top of the box rested an envelope. The handwriting stopped her instantly. It belonged to her father. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. Across the front were 4 simple words. "For my daughter." Madison closed her eyes for a moment. 22 years disappeared. Suddenly she was a little girl again, listening to bedtime stories and waiting for her father to come home. Jonathan quietly stepped away, giving her privacy. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained clear. "My dearest Madison, if you are reading this, then you found the path I hoped you would someday follow." The tears came immediately. She continued reading. "I need you to know something before anything else. I never left because I stopped loving you. I left because I was trying to protect you." Madison lowered the page. Her vision blurred. For 22 years she had carried a question that shaped her entire life. Why did he leave? Now, for the first time, an answer waited in her father's own words. And the rest of the letter promised a truth far bigger than either she or Jonathan had imagined. Madison sat at the small table inside the hidden basement room while Jonathan remained quietly nearby. The old letter trembled slightly in her hands. Every word felt like a voice returning from the past. She wiped her eyes and continued reading. "My dearest Madison, if you have reached this point, then you are finally close enough to the truth for me to trust what comes next. There are things I could never explain when you were a child. There are things I could not explain afterward. Not because I did not want to, but because too many lives depended on silence." Madison swallowed hard and continued. "Years ago, I discovered information that powerful people wanted buried. At first, I believed the truth would speak for itself. I was wrong. The deeper I investigated, the more I realized that exposing everything immediately would place innocent people at risk, including you and your mother." Madison lowered the page for a moment. The room seemed smaller now. Jonathan watched quietly. He could see years of uncertainty slowly being replaced by understanding. Madison returned to the letter. "I was not alone. One man stood beside me when others chose convenience. His name was Charles Reed. Jonathan's expression changed immediately. Madison looked up at him. Neither spoke. She continued reading. Your father and Charles Reed spent many months trying to correct what was happening. We believed the company deserved honesty. We believed people deserved accountability. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed. Madison felt her heartbeat quicken. The next paragraph was written with greater urgency. If you are reading this beside Charles's son, then know this. He may not yet understand the full history of what happened, but his father was a good man. He tried to help me finish what we started. Trust him. Jonathan slowly sat down. For most of his life, he had heard stories about his father's business achievements. Very few stories described the man himself. Yet here was a letter written decades earlier by someone who clearly respected him. Madison continued, there is one final file that contains everything. Evidence, correspondence, financial records, the complete investigation. I hid it where nobody would think to look. Not in the archives. Not in the legal department. Somewhere much closer to the people involved. Madison reached the bottom of the page. A final sentence had been underlined. Look behind the portrait. She stared at the words. Jonathan immediately understood. The executive gallery. Madison looked up. The executive gallery occupied a prominent hallway on the top floor of headquarters. Portraits of former leaders lined the walls, including a large painting of Charles Reed. Neither of them had considered it before. It was visible every day. Hidden in plain sight, Madison folded the letter carefully. For the first time since this journey began, she felt something stronger than grief. Purpose. Her father had not vanished from her life without reason. He had left a path, a trail of clues, a way back to the truth. Jonathan stood and looked toward the door. If your father was right, he said quietly, then everything we have found so far is only the beginning. Madison slipped the letter into her bag and rose to her feet. 22 years earlier, David Harper had started a story he could not finish. Tomorrow, his daughter intended to finish it for him. The next morning arrived with a cold gray sky hanging above Manhattan. Madison barely slept. Every clue, every photograph, every word from her father's letter replayed in her mind throughout the night. By 8 o'clock, she was standing beside Jonathan inside the executive gallery on the top floor of Reed Global headquarters. The hallway stretched nearly 100 feet, lined with portraits of leaders who helped build the company across generations. Employees passed through the corridor every day without giving the paintings much thought. That was exactly why David Harper had chosen the location. Hidden in plain sight, Jonathan stopped in front of the largest portrait in the gallery. Charles Reed looked down from the frame with the calm confidence of a man who spent his life carrying responsibility. For a moment, Jonathan simply stared at the image. He had spent years walking past this portrait, years believing he understood his father's legacy. Yet the last few days had revealed an entirely different story. Madison carefully unfolded the letter again. The final instruction remained unchanged. Look behind the portrait. Jonathan examined the frame. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Then he noticed small marks along the lower edge. Recent marks would have been impossible. These were old, deliberate. He stepped onto a maintenance ladder borrowed from facilities management and carefully lifted the painting away from the wall. Madison held her breath. Behind the portrait sat a narrow recessed compartment hidden inside the structure of the building. Time seemed to stop. Inside the compartment rested a single black document case. Dust covered the surface. The combination lock remained untouched. Jonathan slowly lowered the case onto a nearby table. Neither spoke. They already knew what it was. 22 years of questions sat directly in front of them. The case opened easily. Inside were dozens of organized files, handwritten notes, correspondence records, financial reviews, and investigative summaries. Everything had been preserved with extraordinary care. Madison immediately recognized her father's handwriting throughout the documents. Jonathan began reading the executive summaries. The deeper they went, the clearer the picture became. David Harper had uncovered a long-running scheme involving a senior executive named Leonard Mercer. For years, important information had been concealed from shareholders and internal oversight committees. David documented everything, every concern, every discrepancy, every warning. Beside many of the reports appeared comments written by Charles Reed himself. Support further review. Continue investigation. David is correct. Jonathan read those words twice. Then a third time. His father had never turned against David. He had stood beside him. The realization hit harder than he expected. Madison continued examining the files until she reached the final folder. A sealed statement rested inside, written entirely in her father's hand. She opened it carefully. The message explained everything. David had realized that exposing the truth immediately would place innocent people in the middle of a battle they did not deserve. Rather than risk harming his family, he chose to disappear while leaving behind enough evidence for the truth to survive. He trusted that one day someone would finish what he started. Madison lowered the final page. Tears filled her eyes. Not because she was sad, because for the first time in 22 years she understood. Her father had never abandoned her. He had protected her. Jonathan closed the last folder and looked across the table. Everything they needed was finally there. Every answer, every record, every missing piece. And now only one step remained. The truth had been found. It was time to bring it into the light. 3 weeks later, the largest board meeting in Reed Global's recent history filled the executive conference center. Directors, attorneys, auditors, and senior executives occupied every seat. Large screens displayed verified documents recovered from the hidden archive. Every file had been independently reviewed. Every record had been authenticated. Every unanswered question from 22 years earlier finally had an answer. Madison sat quietly near the back of the room. She still found it strange to be there. Not long ago she had been serving coffee to people who barely noticed her presence. Now she was watching history correct itself because she noticed a single signature. Jonathan stood at the front of the room. The confidence everyone expected from a billionaire chief executive officer remained, but there was something different in his expression. Humility. He understood that this moment was not about business. It was about truth. One by one, the findings were presented. The evidence confirmed that David Harper had acted with integrity throughout his investigation. The records showed that Charles Reed supported his efforts and worked beside him until the very end. The documents also confirmed that David's disappearance had never been an act of abandonment. It had been a sacrifice made to protect the people he loved while ensuring the truth survived. When the final report concluded, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then the board voted unanimously. David Harper's name would be formally restored to the company's history. His contributions would become part of the official corporate record. The hidden investigation would be preserved permanently inside the company archives. Jonathan looked toward Madison. She lowered her eyes for a moment as emotion washed over her. For 22 years she had carried uncertainty. Now that weight was finally gone. A few days later, a small private ceremony took place inside the executive gallery. Employees gathered beneath the portraits that lined the hallway. A new framed display had been added beside Charles Reed's portrait. At the center was a photograph of David Harper smiling beside his longtime friend. Beneath the image sat a simple plaque. David Harper. Integrity endures beyond silence. Madison stood in front of the display and traced her fingers lightly across the frame. She wished her mother could see it. She wished her younger self could see it. The little girl who spent years waiting by the window deserved this moment. Jonathan approached quietly and handed her a document inside a protective case. Madison recognized it immediately. It was the original authorization page that started everything. The page carrying her father's signature. The page she noticed while serving coffee. Jonathan smiled softly. You found what everyone else missed. Madison looked down at the familiar handwriting, then toward the photograph above it. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the signature no longer represented a mystery. It represented a man, a father, a promise kept the only way he knew how. Later that afternoon, Madison returned to the cafe. The espresso machines hummed. Customers chatted quietly. Sunlight streamed through the windows exactly as it had on the day everything began. Yet nothing felt the same. She placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter and glanced toward the city outside. Somewhere between loss and truth, she had found peace. Somewhere between a forgotten signature and a hidden letter, a daughter finally came home to her father's story. And sometimes that is how the most important truths reveal themselves. Not through power, not through status, but through one ordinary person willing to notice what everyone else overlooks.